The idea sounds almost like a paradox at first. Microsoft, a company that once famously called Linux a threat, now actively maintains Linux distributions, contributes to the kernel, and even integrates Linux deeply into its own ecosystem. If you've been around long enough to remember the rivalry between proprietary software and open source, this shift feels less like evolution and more like something quietly strategic. So the question naturally arises, is Microsoft maintaining Linux a genuine embrace of openness, or is it something more subtle, something that could reshape privacy and control in ways that most users aren't paying attention to? To understand what's happening, you have to look beyond the surface. On paper, everything looks positive. Microsoft contributes code to the Linux kernel, supports developers through tools like and even releases its own Linux distributions for internal and cloud use. Developers benefit from better tooling, smoother workflows, and a unified environment. Companies benefit from scalability and integration with cloud platforms. It feels like a win-win scenario. But technological shifts rarely come without trade-offs, and the real story often lies in who ultimately controls the ecosystem. Linux, at its core, has always represented a philosophy as much as a technology. It's about transparency, decentralization, and user control. Anyone can inspect the code, modify it, and distribute their own version. This openness has been a cornerstone of privacy and security. When software is open, it's harder to hide malicious behavior and easier for communities to hold maintainers accountable. That's the promise that has drawn millions of users and developers to Linux over the years. Now contrast that with Microsoft's historical business model. For decades, it has thrived on proprietary systems, data collection, and ecosystem lock-in. Its success has been built on controlling platforms rather than merely participating in them. Even today, a significant part of its revenue comes from cloud services, enterprise solutions, and integrated ecosystems that encourage users to stay within its environment. So when a company with that background becomes deeply involved in Linux, it's worth asking not just what it's contributing, but what it stands to gain. One of the most visible examples of this shift is the Windows Subsystem for Linux. On the surface, it's incredibly useful. Developers can run Linux tools directly on Windows without needing a separate machine or dual boot setup. It reduces friction and makes development more accessible. But it also subtly changes user behavior. Instead of moving to Linux as a primary operating system, many users stay within Windows while accessing Linux features through a controlled layer. This keeps them within Microsoft's ecosystem, even as they use open source tools. This is where the concept of a silent revolution starts to make sense. It's not about overt control or obvious restrictions. It's about reshaping how people interact with technology in ways that gradually shift power back to centralized platforms. When Linux becomes something you access through Microsoft rather than something you run independently, the balance of control changes. You're no longer just a user of Linux. You're a user of Microsoft's version of access to Linux. Privacy is where this shift becomes more concerning. Traditional Linux distributions are known for minimal data collection. Most of them don't track user behavior, and those that do usually make it optional and transparent. In contrast, modern operating systems, especially those tied to large corporations, often include telemetry systems that collect usage data. This data can be used to improve products, but it can also be used for analytics, profiling, and monetization. When Linux tools are integrated into environments that include telemetry, the lines become blurred. Even if the Linux components themselves are open and transparent, the surrounding system may not be. Data could be collected at the host level, outside the visibility of the Linux environment. For users who rely on Linux for privacy, this creates a hidden layer of risk. They may believe they're operating in a secure, open environment, while in reality, their activity is being observed from the outside. Another layer to consider is the cloud. Microsoft's Azure platform heavily supports Linux workloads. In fact, a significant portion of Azure's infrastructure runs on Linux. This has led to increased contributions to the Linux ecosystem, which is undeniably beneficial in many ways. But it also centralizes a large portion of Linux usage within corporate-controlled data centers. Instead of running Linux on personal machines or independent servers, more users and companies are running it on cloud platforms controlled by a handful of major providers. This centralization has implications for privacy and control. When your data and applications are hosted on someone else's infrastructure, you're subject to their policies, their monitoring systems, and their potential vulnerabilities. Even if the underlying operating system is open source, the environment it runs in is not. This creates a situation where Linux remains technically open, but practically dependent on closed systems. There's also the question of influence. By contributing heavily to open source projects, large corporations can shape their direction. This isn't necessarily malicious. It's often a natural result of having the resources to contribute more code and maintain more components, but it does mean that the priorities of these corporations can influence the development of the software. Features that align with the business goals may receive more attention, while others may be. Over time, this can lead to subtle shifts in the ecosystem. Tools and standards may evolve in ways that favor integration with specific platforms. Developers may begin to optimize for those platforms because that's where the users are. Eventually, what was once a decentralized ecosystem starts to orbit around a few dominant players. Again, this isn't something that happens overnight. It's gradual, almost invisible, but its effects can be profound. So is Microsoft maintain Linux a trap? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. It's more accurate to say that it's a complex development with both benefits and risks. On one hand, Microsoft's involvement has brought resources, visibility, and improvements to the Linux ecosystem. On the other hand, it has introduced new dynamics that could affect privacy, control, and independence. For users who care about privacy, the key is awareness. It's important to understand not just what tools you're using, but how they're integrated into larger systems. Running Linux inside a corporate controlled environment is not the same as running it independently. The same tools can have very different implications depending on the context in which they're used. Protecting your privacy in this evolving landscape requires a proactive approach. It means choosing distributions that prioritize transparency, being mindful of where your data is stored, and understanding the trade-offs of convenience versus control. It may also mean accepting a bit more complexity in exchange for greater independence. True privacy often comes with a cost, not necessarily in money, but in effort and awareness. Another important aspect is community. One of the strengths of the Linux ecosystem has always been its community-driven nature. Users and developers collaborate, share knowledge, and hold each other accountable. This creates a level of trust that is difficult to replicate in purely corporate environments. Supporting community-driven projects and staying engaged with open-source communities can help maintain this balance. At the same time, it's important not to fall into extremes. Not every corporate contribution is a threat, and not every integration is a loss of privacy. Technology is rarely black and white. The goal is not to reject progress, but to navigate it thoughtfully. Microsoft's involvement in Linux is part of a broader trend where the lines between open and closed systems are becoming increasingly blurred. Understanding this trend is more important than labeling it. The silent revolution is not about a single company or a single technology. It's about a shift in how computing is structured. From local machines to cloud platforms, from independent systems to integrated ecosystems, from user control to managed environments. These changes bring undeniable benefits, but they also require a new level of vigilance. In the end, the question isn't whether Microsoft maintained Linux is inherently good or bad. It's whether users are aware of the implications and willing to make informed choices. Privacy is not something that can be taken for granted, even in open source environments. It's something that must be actively protected, especially as technology continues to evolve. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's that control matters. Who controls the platform? Who controls the data? And who controls the direction of development? These questions are more important than ever, and they don't always have obvious answers. But asking them is the first step toward understanding the bigger picture. As the landscape continues to change, the responsibility ultimately lies with the users. To stay informed, to question assumptions, and to choose tools and platforms that align with their values. The revolution may be silent, but its impact is not. And whether it leads to greater freedom or greater control depends largely on how we respond to it.